So, the only official part of the conversation will just be an introduction.
Sure.
Who are you? What's your name? Where do you work? What's your favorite dessert?
Oh, favorite dessert. That's a good one. So I'm David Cwiertny. Happy to go by Dave. I'm a professor of civil and environmental engineering and also of chemistry here at the University of Iowa. My expertise is in water quality, water treatment. Here at the university, I also direct a center called the Center for Health Effects of Environmental Contamination. So we do a lot of work sort of at this interface between the environment and health. And then my favorite dessert, oh boy. So I'm going to tell you, I don't really... So I'm lactose intolerant, so I can't eat ice cream. Otherwise, ice cream would be it.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no, lactose intolerance ruins a ton of desserts, which doesn't give me an excuse to like not be in better shape, you know. But I don't know. What do I enjoy? A good cookie will do it.
A good cookie.
I think so. Or that's boring though. I think, but we'll go with that, I guess.
Okay, and actually, right when you introduced yourself, it did remind. Okay, so before we started rolling camera and audio, you said, what do you want to talk about? And I was like, oh, I'll figure it out once we start talking. And as soon as you introduced yourself, I was like, right, the health effects.
The health guy, yeah.
And so, I mean, I'm tempted to jump right in there, but first...
Do what you want to do. I'm comfortable. Right?
Let's talk about your traveling, though. So You've been a very difficult person to get a hold of. And other people who I have met who know you are like, oh, David is so busy. He is so busy. So what is it that you're busy doing?
From the work perspective, when you and I talked, it was a busy month where I had a lot of speaking engagements. Like everybody in Iowa wants to talk about environmental issues right now, particularly at the intersections of health and water quality. Okay. And so some of it is in my role as director of this state-funded center, I do feel a pretty heavy obligation that when people would like to hear from us...
The director of a state-funded center?
Yeah, so that's the Center for Health Effects of Environmental Contamination, which has been around since about the late 80s.
Okay.
It was founded through the Groundwater Protection Act. And so in that capacity, I feel the need to be accessible, talk to people about what we do and what we know. And so that particular day, I was driving down to speak to a group of the Iowa Association of Water Agencies, and so a lot of the folks that run water supplies here in the state of Iowa, and talking with them about sort of emerging challenges for water providers in terms of the chemical risks in their source water and what sort of future regulation might be coming and what it all means for like the health of the people they serve.
Yeah.
And so those sorts of things. And then, but you know, I'm a professor that teaches. I have a research group with 5 PhD students, and I advise them. My center has a bunch of staff, and we have our projects and the work that we do. And then I also have 2 very active kids that swim, and so my weekends are usually full, going to swim meets or soccer games or those sorts of things, because I've got a very active, soon-to-be 16-year-old and 13-year-old.
So wow, those are young ages. They're a handful. How long, go backwards in time. Sure. How long have you been working in this field in the state of Iowa?
Yeah, it's a great question. So 2011 is when I moved back here. So I did I had finished my PhD in 2005 at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. And then after you do your PhD, you do what's called postdoc research. And so just 2 years of research after your PhD. And I did that here at the University of Iowa with a former colleague in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. So that was 2005, 2007. Then I moved back to California, and that's where I grew up. I started teaching at UC Riverside and was there for 4 years doing environmental work. And then a job opportunity opened here, and it was a good chance for my wife and I to come back. She's from Wisconsin, so has Midwest roots. And we really enjoyed our time in Iowa City. And the University of Iowa has always done a lot of really good environmental and water-focused research. And so that brought me back.
Okay, so when you started on the job in 2011, what were the primary water concerns that you were hearing about or studying versus what we're hearing and seeing now? Is there a difference?
Oh, absolutely. So that's a really great question. So when I moved here in 2011, it's funny, I moved from UC Riverside, which is effectively in a desert in Southern California and like the inland part of it. And there
Don't they call it the Inland
they
Empire?
call it the Inland Empire.
I thought so, yeah.
And it actually, yeah, and no one really knows why, and there's like a variety of explanations, and some aren't so great.
Right, right.
Yeah.
They're not all flattering.
No,
Yeah.
one's like linked to the, I think, the Klan, but we'll leave it at that's the past. But at the time, I was studying things that were relevant to Southern California, like water reuse and like new technologies for water, like to take wastewater and turn it into cleaner water. And I only say that because just as like a symbol of how things have changed, the idea of me coming here and continuing to do things on like water reuse and water scarcity didn't make a lot of sense. But now we've got communities with the changing climate in Iowa that are considering things like treating wastewater to augment water supplies. And I was in Osceola a couple years ago after some of the extreme drought. They were thinking about augmenting their reservoir with wastewater. So that's a good example of treated wastewater. So that's a good example of, you know, I've been here long enough where sort of perceptions have changed, as well as sort of the state of play in terms of our climate and our water resources.
That's interesting.
But I think, you know, in very Iowa-centric ways, I got here in, most folks were talking about water quality in the context of nutrient runoff, which we still talk about, but more from the perspective of the Gulf of Mexico and the dead zone, that a lot of the nutrients that leave Iowa work their way in the Mississippi River and get down to the Gulf and sort of create this zone that can't support life by depleting oxygen.
Now, I'm going to apologize to my listeners who already know what I'm about to ask you, and they've heard me maybe ask it to maybe one or two of the other people that I've interviewed, but nutrients are good for us.
Yeah.
So why is it bad when they're in our drinking water?
Yeah, so like lots of things, a little bit is beneficial and too much is usually problematic. And so in our drinking water, so there's a couple different things going on here. When we talk about nutrients in the context of like the Gulf of Mexico and the dead zone, we think of things like nitrate, and we think of things like phosphorus, so nitrogen and phosphorus. Mm-hmm. When it comes to drinking water, the thing that we really worry about is that nitrogen piece and that specific form of nitrogen called nitrate. And nitrate is something we regulate in drinking water because too much of it's a problem. It can interfere with things like how oxygen gets transported through the body. And that's why we end up regulating nitrate where we do, is particularly susceptible are young infants. And so if you can envision infants that are drinking formula prepared with nitrate-rich water, the nitrate gets transformed in the body to nitrite, and that begins to interfere with how hemoglobin transports oxygen. So
that's the best description I've ever heard.
Oh, well, thank you.
Okay,
I get asked a lot.
That really helps me understand why it's a health risk.
Yeah,
that's a really good example.
And an important point there is it's what's known as an acute health risk, and that, you know, if you're drinking, someone who's susceptible to that is drinking high nitrate water, they'll get sick immediately. And so it's one of the few things we regulate in drinking water for an immediate health impact, because most of the things we regulate for are like lifetime exposures and diseases like cancer that can develop over decades to you know, multiple decades. So that's our real challenge. And I will say, getting back to your question, I think some of the shift, we still care about the dead zone. We still have a lot of that talk here. You know, I moved here in 2011. That seemed to be most of the focus. We still talk about that in 2025. There's a lot more talk now about sort of the damage that those water quality challenges cause here at home in terms of impairment of people's private wells, impairment of source waters that communities use for drinking water. And so that's the shift that I've seen.
That's a really interesting transition that they weren't thinking as much about, well, okay, if it's, I'm sorry, I'm just thinking out loud. So they were thinking about, okay, there's this dead zone down in the Gulf of Mexico that's somehow related to Iowa, but they weren't thinking, well, what is this doing to us here?
And I don't want to say that nobody was, but
sure.
I mean, I felt that when I got here, and a lot of the water quality challenges were non-point source pollution, like the things that we are applying on land or we have in our runoff from both cities and ag areas.
Yeah.
That ends up impacting our creeks and streams and our rivers that then combine, you know, we're all part of that Mississippi River watershed. They work their way thousands of miles away and sort of cause this ecological catastrophe down in the Gulf. And I mean, we think we're beginning to appreciate that there's a lot of challenges to our groundwater, to our surface water here in terms of, can we really rely on them for drinking water? And we saw that through the summer in Des Moines, where the nitrate levels were high and they had to put water restrictions in place because they were struggling to sort of produce a safe drinking water that's compliant with federal standards.
I want to go back to that. So let's do that next. But before that, can we talk briefly about the hypoxic zone?
Sure.
I'm actually trying to make contact with people down in the Gulf to try to see like who's a local mover and shaker who knows about this. I even thought of like trying to seeing if there's footage that show the dead zone. I don't even know if you can visually tell if there's a difference there.
Perhaps.
But like, what is it? How did it form? How is Iowa implicated?
Sure. All excellent questions. And so when the nutrients that run off our land, these is primarily things like...
So you mean like Flintstone, when people like throw out Flintstone vitamins and they break down...
I'm talking about... so the big ones being nitrogen and phosphorus, as we mentioned.
Okay.
And the sources of those are certainly like things like fertilizer that we apply on land.
Okay.
But also they come from like wastewater treatment plants, right? So we like
part of the treatment process?
No, it's in the waste they're treating. So like we excrete as humans, we excrete nitrogen and phosphorus in our waste.
So you could have a wastewater treatment plant in a state that has no agricultural fertilizer, and there's still going to be some of the effluent coming out of the, I don't know, effluent's the scientific
word. That's the right word. Yeah, that'll work.
So it would still have some nitrates in it. It would have
some form of nitrogen. It might be a different form.
Just because of human waste.
Correct.
Okay.
And there's other sources too. So like I've done work with collaborators in like the Tampa area of Florida, and one of their biggest source of nitrogen is it is things like urban runoff and wastewater plants and their discharges, but also deposition from the atmosphere, because some of the byproducts of combustion of fossil fuels are nitrogen-based nitrogen-based oxides, like in gas form, that can deposit through rainfall.
Wow.
And given that they have a lot of traffic and a lot of people, that can be an important source. And so one of the important things when thinking about nutrient dynamics is that there are lots of possible sources. In some places, some are more important than others. And so here we know we have the sort of experts have looked at published reports and looked at the numbers, and we know that our land use activities like agriculture are a significant contributor of the nutrients to our waterways. They work their way to the Gulf of Mexico. Essentially what happens is these nutrients, it's the good part of the nutrients, in that the sort of the microorganisms that are there feast on them and bloom up as algae, right?
Okay.
But then they kind of outgrow their food supply. They die. And as they die, they fall to the bottom of the Gulf, they decompose, and we know that decomposition of things like living matter consumes oxygen. Okay. And so if you've ever uncovered, unfortunately, like a dead animal or something and it stinks a bit, that's because the oxygen's been consumed through the decomposition process, and you're smelling other things like sulfur that starts to get reduced instead.
I never knew that.
So it all makes sense from like a chemical cycle perspective. But the downside here is oxygen gets consumed, and that drives the oxygen level in the water really low to where it can't support life anymore. And so that's why it gets called a dead zone. Hypoxia literally means like low oxygen.
So the microorganisms are the ones that feast on the fertilizer and stuff and the nutrition coming through, and then the larger species are the ones that end up dying.
Well, as they grow, so it's like algae that feed on it, grow into a very big bloom, and then die, and then decompose, and that decomposition process sucks up all the oxygen, and then that drives the oxygen levels low. It's a little more complex than that, where the temperature of the water matters. So a lot of this happens in the summer months. Because you'll have sort of warmer water on top of colder water, so it sort of doesn't mix as well, so that allows the things that die to settle.
Yeah.
But that's the gist of it, and you end up with these large swaths of area. Sometimes, like you'll see the headlines that it's the size of the state of New Jersey, that aren't able to support life because the oxygen levels are too low.
Okay. And I actually didn't plan on talking about this
That's
much,
fine.
But since we're here, okay. At what point did someone in Iowa get a phone call from someone in the Mississippi Delta going, "Hey, y'all, I've got a dead zone down here, and I think your water coming through your fields has something to do with it"? How did that link get made?
So I don't really know how far back that went. I do know that about the time I got here, and probably before that, there's a Gulf Hypoxia Task Force.
Say what?
It sort of makes up. It's the EPA has it on their website. Our Secretary of Agriculture, Mike Naig, is one of the, I think, co-chairs of it currently. I could be mistaken.
Wow.
But it's essentially a group that gets together and thinks at the watershed scale about the contributions from up the watershed here in Iowa, Illinois, and how the nutrients that we lose off our land impact as they work their way down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. So there's been large scale sort of planning and sort of strategizing around the Gulf. There's been targets and goals that are set. And I think 2013 is when Iowa instituted its sort of nutrient reduction strategy as part of the Gulf Hypoxia Task Force to sort of start to make headways in terms of our nutrient release.
Have we met those goals?
No, the evidence doesn't suggest that we're making enough pace if we're making any progress at all. And so we've got a ways to go on that. And at the same time, like as I've noted, I think people become more aware as we have communities with higher nitrate levels in their source waters for drinking. It has these challenges that come with it closer to home.
It's just really crazy that fertilizer that makes plants grow in the right concentrations in drinking water can make children sick and adults sick in a high concentration, right? And then create a hypoxic zone. It's like, it's just weird that something that grows so much, helps grow so much food, is also has a downside.
Well,
to it.
It's something we need. It's nitrogen built into proteins and lots of different sorts of biomolecules that are important for like who we are, and that's why we need it. But I mean, lots of things. You look at your multivitamin. If you take one, you'll see a lot of things on the back. Like you'll see chromium, and we know a little bit of chromium in certain forms is valuable, but too much of it can be problematic. And so it's not all that uncommon to have. It's not like one uniform direction from good to bad, right? It's kind of a dip. You don't have enough of it, it's problematic. You have too much of it, it's problematic. You need to find that right amount. And that makes things hard because finding the right amount and managing the right amount is always difficult. And it's difficult for people that are trying to apply the right amount to get the right types of yields. It's difficult for water treatment to make sure that they're sort of, when they have to treat water and add certain things to get the water safe, they have to add the right amount because if too much, it's problematic. So it's about finding that balance. And I think right now we're a little bit out of that balance when it comes to some of the water quality challenges we have.
Okay, this thing occurred to me the other night. I think about this stuff all the time since I'm working on this project. So what I was thinking about, it's a multi-part question. Right now, what is the standard in terms of how many parts per million or milligrams or whatever for nitrate in our drinking water? Like if I go to the water fountain here down the hall, what's the limit right now of how much they're saying is safe?
So right now the standard is set at 10 milligrams per liter.
10 milligrams per liter, okay.
We call milligrams per liter parts per million.
Oh, it's the same thing.
Yeah, they are one and the same for water. It's I won't get into the details.
That's okay.
If you want to sit on one of my
10
lectures
is fine.
next semester, I can teach you how you convert between them. But a milligram per liter is a part per million.
Okay.
And then and we do that, and this is important, for nitrogen, it's 10 milligrams per liter as nitrogen. So the way we report it is just really in an accounting system for how much nitrogen is in that nitrate. Because nitrate is actually like nitrogen and oxygen. The way we report it is really just focused on the nitrogen content.
Okay.
That's tricky because there's another way it can get reported, which is not as milligram per liter as nitrogen, but as milligram per liter as nitrate. And that that 10 milligram per liter as N, as the drinking water standard, as nitrogen, is closer to about 44 milligrams per liter as nitrate. And other parts of the world use that as nitrate convention.
Okay.
And sometimes lately people have been trying to use at-home test strips to test their drinking water,
right,
because they are worried about nitrate levels. And a lot of those test strips can be in that as nitrate. So we've received a lot of people inquiring about why they see 40 milligrams per liter in their water, and it's fourfold the 10. And we have to tell folks that it's probably just this tricky convention that confuses students that we teach and confuses the general public and makes this thing overly complicated. It's just the different ways in how we report it. So
how did we determine it would be 10 as a safe level? So
that's a great question. When EPA regulates something, they do a pretty extensive risk assessment.
Okay.
And so at the time that I talk about how in some of my presentations, nitrate was one of the original sort of chemicals that was regulated when the Safe Drinking Water Act was put in place, but it was at the time viewed as like an interim standard and wasn't really sort of formalized until about, I think 1989 and started
Okay.
taking effect in like the early 90s, 90, 91.
That's really not that long ago.
Not that long ago.
Yeah.
Well, the Safe Drinking Water Act's only like the mid 70s, right? And so
Okay.
it's in the grand scheme of things, we really
Gosh,
haven't
that's
been treating
crazy.
drinking water federally.
Wow.
I was born in 78, so just a bit before I was born.
Yeah.
But at the time, they looked at all the available data, and they, I show some of those historical documents when I present on nitrate. That at the time, most of the compelling data was around that what was called blue baby syndrome or methemoglobinemia, and that's that phenomenon where the children can get essentially deprived of oxygen from high nitrate water.
And is that the one where they don't necessarily die from it, but like their skin tone is sort of bluish?
Sure, and that's a symbol of oxygen deprivation.
Okay.
And they can die in acute case, in severe cases, but we
Okay.
haven't had a blue baby syndrome fatality in many, many years.
What is that long word that starts with an M?
So that's the methemoglobinemia.
Oh, okay.
Don't make me spell it, because I can't.
Okay.
At least not, I mean, I could write it out if I had a practice, but that's what it is.
Okay.
And it's tied to that hemoglobin, right? That's the hemoglobinemia part. Hemoglobin is, we learn in elementary school biology that's kind of the magic piece that moves through the blood and transports oxygen.
Yeah.
The methemoglobinemia is kind of getting at this interference that can happen.
Interesting.
So at the time, some of the scoping documents from the EPA sort of acknowledged that there wasn't enough evidence for other health risks like birth defects or like cancer, that the science wasn't really compelling or complete at the time. And so it wasn't like they ignored those health outcomes. It's just that they didn't have sufficient evidence at the time to do anything. I do think it's important for people to appreciate that when these standards get set, they sort of look at the literature and they put a lot of different safety factors in place too. And so that they really are trying to find a number that is protective for an entire population, knowing that some folks are more vulnerable than others, right? Like we all have a little bit of different inherent susceptibility to certain types of exposures. And so the EPA sets these standards usually with an eye towards being conservative, of thinking about other ways you get exposed and who could be more susceptible in a population when you think about like immunocompromised or the young or the elderly. But that's the process. It's the look at the available literature that sort of thinks about exposure and translating that to an adverse health response.
Yeah.
And then trying to find something that's sufficiently protective, and that's where they landed at 10.
So it's been 10 since the 70s,
Uh,
or 89. I think
yeah,
was it?
since and I'll say 89. That's when we have really good data, because they started enforcing the standard and more people were testing and reporting. So the data really gets quite good and around like the late 80s.
So when our water treatment plant here in Iowa City, their goal is we're gonna kick out this healthy drinking water at no higher than 10 parts per million. Okay, so what happened in Des Moines? You referenced something there.
Yeah, so in Des Moines, they rely on 3 different sources of water: 2 rivers, the Raccoon and the Des Moines River, and then what they call their gallery, which is essentially groundwater that's influenced by those rivers. And because they're these wells, they tend to be a little bit less vulnerable to nitrate contamination. So if you kind of want to rank the order of where they have nitrate vulnerability, it's the Des Moines and Raccoon, and then their gallery is the lowest. And so what the water work operators do is kind of play this game of, they know the quality of those 3 sources, and then they do their best to blend to the capacity that they can, because each of those is sort of finite, to make something that's 10. Right. So you can envision if it's like the rivers are 11 and 12 and then the gallery 7, they'll try to use more of the gallery to bring down the others and produce something that's under 10.
Wow.
What they found themselves in this situation this summer, that the river values were high and they probably didn't have enough capacity and the gallery diluted down, but then they got to a point where all 3 sources were above 10.
All 3?
Yeah, and this happens from time to time, but not frequently, and they would prefer that they avoid having it ever happen again, I think, at the waterworks. But they have it. But for these occasions, they have a nitrate removal system. So since I think the late 80s again, I should know the year, but since about that same time frame, they've installed a nitrate removal system.
So that means that was out of necessity, even in the 80s.
Yeah, let's say late 80s, early 90s.
So they had a similar situation even in the 80s?
Yes.
Wow. And does that mean if all were above 10, that there were a bunch of sciencey people going, we need to figure out why these values are going so high? Do we know where the point source was? Or is it all considered non-point source?
So I can't really speak to like what they were thinking back in the time, in like let's say the early 90s.
Yeah.
I think, again, this is one of those things where you're catching me not having...
Before the year 2000.
I should have studied. It's been about 30 years, is usually what I say, that we've been struggling with nitrate in Des Moines. So I want to say it's like the early 90s. At the time, I think with the standard in place and knowing the vulnerability of their source waters, they knew they needed to do something else.
Okay.
Because your options when your nitrate is high in your source water is you either install a treatment technique like what they use in Des Moines, which is an ion exchange system that will selectively remove nitrate.
Right.
Or you got to find another source of water. And once you're in a city like Des Moines, there's not a lot of other places to look.
Sure.
That can produce the amount of water sort of sustainably or reliably for that population, right? So they installed a treatment operation that had a limited capacity, though, right? Like, not all the water that comes through the Fluor Drive plant gets treated by nitrate removal, because there's like a bottleneck or a capacity on how much they can treat to remove nitrate.
Oh.
So to get back to your question as to what happened in Des Moines this summer,
right?
The levels were high enough in the sources, and thinking about how they were sort of limited by how much volume they could actually pass through the nitrate removal system, the math didn't work out where they could keep the demand as high as it was in the hot summer months, treat enough water to drive the other three sources in combination below 10. So they had to lower that demand piece, right? So if you bring down how much water people's using, there's less water you need to treat, right?
Yeah.
And so they're constantly balancing supply and demand. And one lever they have to pull, in addition to balancing those three sources, is the treatment system. But the treatment system is only going to get you so far if it can only treat a certain portion of the other sources, right? So they just found themselves in this position where they had to reduce the demand to be able to produce sufficient water below 10. So and that's why they put a restriction on lawn watering. And they wouldn't let people, it wasn't like they were saying people couldn't use their water for in the home for showers and drinking and other things. That was never the case. This was the issue of, we're going to say you can't water your lawns because that's a large use of water, and it's going to drive up demand to the point where we're not going to be able to keep the rest of it below 10.
Yeah.
And that's one of those instances where those restrictions were in place not because there wasn't enough water. There was plenty of water. There just wasn't enough clean water.
Yeah. Do we know, does anyone definitively know what drove those values over 10?
I think the challenge we have in the climate that is sort of coming to Iowa today is we have these periods of, so go back to 2024.
Okay.
And I want to say in like May and June, we had some pretty big rainfall. That was sort of in 2024, we had some communities that were really hit by devastating floods in the northwest Iowa. And that came after several years of drought. So we were dry, and then we got a bunch of rain. And actually last year at about that time, in 2024, in about like May and June, nitrates were high for Des Moines. And they were contemplating doing something similar, restricting use.
Right.
But then the rain kind of stopped. And so the rivers sort of got back to a normal level. But then it got dry again. And that we went to this cycle of having an extended period of dry. And then early this spring and summer, we got a lot of rainfall again. And so it's this cycle of a lot of dry, short period of a lot of wet, a lot of dry, short period of a lot of wet. And what that's doing is just mobilizing everything that's been land applied in those dry periods. So if you have nitrogen that's been applied as fertilizer to land, it hasn't had the rainfall to push it through the tile lines into the stream network. It was just the right amount of rainfall to keep nitrate, and the right pattern of rainfall to keep nitrate high for an extended period, because I think they ended up having water restrictions for over 100 days. So the challenge ends up being sort of, people will talk about weather being a big driver. It absolutely is, but it's also the fact that there's this reservoir of nitrogen on the surface that is just there to keep leaching out, and that's a problem. So because it's especially when you think about the land application and then sort of these tile lines that get the water off the land quickly, there's not a lot of chance for sort of the nature and the subsurface to sort of do its normal thing. We've short-circuited a lot of this, and by getting the water off the land so quickly, we're just getting a lot of that nutrient transport straight into the stream network. Then that's just sort of, if you get the rainfall, you're going to keep the levels persistently high.
Okay, I have a pie in the sky question, and this is the question I was pondering last night. So we already know that we can get, that obviously levels come in probably higher than 10, and then they need to knock it down to 10,
Yep.
right? So, and it's a result of things people do to the land. So I was thinking, okay, what if you lived in an imaginary place called Iowa, where there was zero agriculture, zero fertilizer, no extra anything applied to the surface of the land? What would our background nitrate levels be in the river systems if it's the year 1800?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm probably not the best suited to answer it. I've heard some folks talk about this, that sort of, I mean, it wouldn't be what it is today, right? We know the levels are higher now than they would be. I mean, we teach in engineering, we teach a concept of mass balance, right? Like when you put something, when you put something on the land, it doesn't disappear. It's just going to kind of move, right? It's going to go somewhere. And so if that gets out of balance and we're putting too much down, we're going to end up with more in places we don't want it, right? And so it's for whatever the reason, if we're putting more fertilizer and nutrients down than plants need, and for whatever the reason, maybe circumstances just don't allow the crop to grow because the weather's bad.
Yeah.
It's just going to, that excess, we know it moves. We know it's going to work its way into the stream network, and it's just that imbalance. And so your scenario of like, if you have no land application, if there's just no source of it, well, then it would certainly be lower because there's just not the mass of it around to move. The question is, what sort of
how do we
things
get back to that?
Well,
I
think it's like what sort of things need to be done to find a better balance, right?
Yeah.
Because we're not really balanced.
Yeah.
I think the struggles in Des Moines sort of show that our river systems or ecosystems are out of balance. We need to be thinking about ways to do that, and knowing that if this your mythical land that doesn't have any of that would kind of have a lot of other issues and upending people's livelihoods and other things, and so it's trying to find something that is a reasonable step forward to make progress, which I think a lot of folks feel is sort of not happening, and probably kind of as imaginary as your imaginary land.
Yeah.
And so that's the thing. I mean, I just would keep going back to the fact that the levels being as high as they are in the rivers should be telling us that something's not right.
Yeah.
And we need to be figuring out how to respond to that and get to a better position, because inevitably, if we keep putting water providers, not just Des Moines but others, in this position, because other cities on rivers had high levels too, right? It didn't get nearly the attention, but like Cedar Rapids had high levels.
Oh.
Eventually we're going to end up with populations that can't drink their drinking water, and I've said before in a few other places that I don't think Iowa is ready for having like 500 to 600,000 people served by the Des Moines Waterworks being given do not drink orders, right? Like that is...
Can nitrates, this is just a silly question, but can nitrates be boiled out?
No.
Like you can't evaporate it just by boiling water?
No, in fact, you get warned not to do that, because if you boil off the water, the nitrate will be left behind. You're actually just going to concentrate it. Yeah.
Ah.
It's not so we boil for like bacteria and things like that are living that we worry about making us sort of intestinally ill.
Okay.
So viruses and bacteria and other pathogens, because boiling kills them.
Okay.
But most chemicals we worry about in water don't break down under just the heat of boiling. So all you're going to be doing is concentrating them, and that's probably worse for you. Is
nitrate in these concentrations, in the way that it behaves once it's in the environment, is it considered a persistent organic pollutant? So it's not organic, because organic is something we reserve in like chemistry to things that are carbon based. So that's just sort of like a wonky, jargony thing that when you take organic chemistry is like a sophomore here, you're studying carbon based molecules, whereas inorganic are things that are not made of carbon. So nitrogen and oxygen being nitrate, but you would call it persistent. I mean, to some degree. I mean, we know that there's the nitrogen cycle, that there's different forms of nitrogen, right? Like,
ammonia, like we excrete, or fertilizer would contain what we call a reduced forms of nitrogen, like ammonia.
Okay.
And then there's things like nitrogen gas in the air. That's like an elemental form of
Sure.
nitrogen. So that's just simple
Oh.
N2. Whereas, and then nitrate's just another form of it. So the nitrogen itself is persistent, and it's not going away. It might shapeshift and take on different forms
Okay.
as it moves through us or moves through the environment.
So
But
it's not
nitrate
that,
is one of the more stable ones, which is why we see it in our water. Like the things that we apply as fertilizer, as ammonia, as anhydrous ammonia, or the reduced forms that are in manure, even in our human waste, usually end up as nitrate.
so it's not that we're using something dangerous to boost growth. It's just that we're just using so much of it.
I think that's
that's
right.
causing the issue. Random question: what is UAN 32%? I came across an article about the Nishnabotna
Yeah.
fertilizer spill, and they kept on saying UAN 32%.
I think it's just it's a formulation name, and so that's a mixture. I don't remember at the time. I knew what it was from the Nishnabotna spill, because I remember I was actually out in the community out there talking on the issues.
Oh.
With a really cool group. It was a ecologist from Iowa State and an English professor here that I work with. And
Oh, okay.
Seth Watkins, who's a local farmer in the southwest Iowa area, and we kind of did a community event just talking about the watershed. So I knew at the time, but it's just the 32, I think, pertains to like a weight percentage of one of the ingredients. It might be ammonia or a mixture of it, but
so it's not the most common type of fertilizer, for example.
It's a type. It's a formulation type.
And that's actually what interested me. I was like, wait, are there different types of nitrogen that we use? I
Sure.
just thought it would just be like, there's one type of Windex that you clean windows with, but that's a probably terrible parallel. But like,
No, I mean,
so there's all sorts of different concentrations, like competing fertilizer companies kind of come up with their own mixtures.
I think so, yeah. That's a reasonable enough way to sort of try to summarize it. I think there's different ways you can blend it. There's different active ingredients, different forms, whether it's urea, which is another form of reduced nitrogen that plants can utilize, versus ammonia. And so it's just pertaining to the mixture of the forms.
Okay.
And if it's sort of blended with anything else, like a phosphorus or something else.
Okay.
And since I haven't thought about those in a while, I don't want to speak erroneously about which particular one it is. Someone will say I should probably know off the top of my head, but it's been a long day.
Okay, so we talked about blue baby syndrome.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the rates of cancer
Sure.
here in the state. Is there a proven, I don't know if vector is the right word, that's probably not the right word, but is fertilizer or pesticides, like, do we have a proven vector for why the cancer rates are so high in the state, or do we still really not know what it could be?
I would say the challenge is there's never going to be just one thing, right? And so we talk about this a lot because people are rightly concerned, and I think the high rates of cancer or new cancers has really sort of struck through with the sort of general public here, and a lot of folks are concerned.
When you say new cancers, what does that mean?
So what you're hearing about when we have, so Iowa has the second highest rate of new cancers. It's like the incidence rate of how many new cases do we have. And so when you hear the statistic of we're the second highest rate, it's actually the incidence rate, which are it's effectively the new cancer rates.
Oh, so it doesn't mean really rare cancers, outlier cancers. It's just new cases.
Yes, exactly. So that's just the reporting of it, right? And so we have the second highest rate and the fastest growing rate in one of, I think, only 2 states with a rising rate. And so the state that is in front of us is Kentucky, which a lot of people attribute to the smoking that is done there, amongst a few other things.
Yeah.
So there's lots of folks at the university asking this question of what's the drivers? And it's a combination of things. And so there are social and behavioral factors, right? There are, if you drink, we know alcohol is a risk factor for cancer. Certain types of, like a sedentary lifestyle, obesity, smoking, if you smoke. Now, smoking is a risk factor. Not everybody who smokes gets cancer, but you have a greater likelihood. And so that's the other challenge here, is we're talking about probabilities and risks, right? So when it comes to the environment, environmental risk factors are ones that generally don't get a lot of attention, because the places we see the environment being problematic are usually in like these extreme incidences of like spills, right? If you're a community that's living near an industrial factory that's been discharging and polluting and you're drinking contaminated water, it's instances like those where you might have more confidence that, well, this population has the elevated type of, say, blood cancer, and they're putting out something that some lab studies have shown might be associated with blood cancer. It's a pretty good probability that due to the extreme sort of exposure scenario that's their risk. So here in Iowa, it's a little bit harder, right? I always talk about this and say that, like, one, we know that we have environmental risk factors. Like, we have groundwater that has arsenic in it, and we regulate arsenic under the Safe Drinking Water Act for its ability to increase risks of certain forms of cancer. And we know we have a lot of folks drinking private wells in Iowa that might have arsenic in them at unsafe levels. So is the environment influencing Iowa's cancer rates? There are places, if you're drinking arsenic-contaminated groundwater and don't know it because your well hasn't been tested, that is certainly a risk factor that could be impacting you and your surrounding community.
Yeah.
We only really started testing sort of in mass at large scale for arsenic in private wells in 2016 or so, when the state added it to a testing program for private wells.
Wow.
When you think about the timescales over which cancer could be discovered and sort of evolve,
sure,
we're still kind of figuring that out. And there's lots of folks that have studied links between arsenic exposure and different forms of cancer, including some of the cancers we know we have high rates in terms of, like skin melanoma and prostate cancer. So there's things like this. So we also have, our groundwater, for folks that are relying on groundwater, we have places, everyone's familiar with radium in air, and so we worry about radium, and we have high rates of lung cancer. But there's things like radium and uranium that are also cancer-causing substances that can be present in water.
You mean separate from radon?
Separate from.
There's those other two things. I didn't even know that.
So the point I'm trying to make is that there are certainly places in Iowa where we need to be worried about our environment. And they're not the ones that people want their mind to wander to on thinking about agriculture. Yeah. Because these are naturally occurring things that nobody put in the subsurface but whoever created the planet, right? And it's just a question of whether or not you've been unfortunate to drill into rock that has those things. Yeah. And you haven't tested and don't know about it. And the other part that I use that as an example for is the risk varies across the state. We know that there are people that have, like, arsenic is a real issue in places like Cerro Gordo County, less so in other parts of the state. And so the idea of environmental vulnerabilities will vary a lot across the state. So when it comes to the environment, the unfortunate reality is we need a far more nuanced discussion than a lot of folks probably want to have these days. But all that being said, I think there's plenty of evidence that when you think about not just these naturally occurring factors, there's been plenty of studies that have thought about, pesticides and nitrate and even emerging chemicals like PFAS and forever chemicals, which we know we have some places in the state. There's enough that are sort of making these associations that if we feel like we want to do something about it, we certainly shouldn't wait, right? Right. But that's those decisions are above my pay grade, right?
Let's pivot to talk about, it's still on the topic, but the way the water is accelerated as it comes off the land after a rain event. I asked you the question again before the camera's rolling. One of the topics I'd want to ask you about is just how big is the water diversion project if you look at Iowa as a whole? Sure. Through drain tilage and bowl ditches and things like that. How big is this water diversion thing? And I know it's not a project people are like, I want to be a part of the water diversion project. I know it's not like that, but I mean, just when you look at it in aggregate, is there really a lot of water diversion happening, and is it related to the hypoxic zone and the water treatment levels being high in terms of nitrates? So is the rapid evacuation of the water off the land directly related to the higher rates we see downstream?
So I guess I would say, as far as the scale of things like, drainage lines and agricultural tile, there's a lot of it. I think there's statistics that talk about us, I think, having the most land, based on acreage in terms that's been tiled. and it's sort of a necessary piece to have the agricultural productivity we do, because the water table, those things lower the water table, right? So otherwise the land would probably have too much moisture to be as productive as it is for the crops that we grow.
Right.
And so they certainly have an impact because they move water, right? And water that falls on land works its way into that tile, particularly as it raises the groundwater level, right? Because all those things are doing are just pushing down the water table. So it's just a mechanism of mobilization.
Mm-hmm.
And those things feed a lot of our creeks that turn into our streams, that turn into our rivers. And so if there's chemicals that are running off in those, it's no different than, say, like a wastewater effluent outfall or an urban stormwater outfall. Like you see these, you can go out to the Iowa River here on campus, and we've got these pipes that discharge straight to the river that are just moving water off the land. We see this do not dump into these drains because they go to the river. We spent most of like what we do, and from an engineering standpoint, is we want to get water where it falls and get it off right away, because we don't want it accumulating.
Right.
And so we've completely sort of re-engineered the hydrologic cycle, both urban and rural, and I think with that comes the appreciation that it can move chemicals more quickly that we either put down on land intentionally or unintentionally. And so like in urban areas, all the stuff that breaks down off our tires, you talk about tire wear particles and microplastics, all the urban chemicals, all that stuff mobilizes. So we know those things carry waste, or carry sort of the stuff that's around when it just gets swept away and washed away. How do you manage that is the question. How do you manage it at the scale at which the water is flowing is the big challenge, right? I mean, when it's farming, they use edge of field practices, but you need a lot of them to capture the amount of water that's moving.
Yeah.
It's probably no different in an urban area where you really got to be smart about capturing runoff that way too.
Yeah.
So.
And in your work, you mentioned, I think during our phone call, that you have actually, I'm describing this like you've seen a rare animal, but you've actually seen drain tiles, right?
Oh, of course. Yeah, we've
So, I mean, I've never seen one. I've driven over a lot of Iowa at this point, and I've almost had car accidents. I'm like, was that a drain tile outflow? Like, what was that? And I still haven't seen one.
We work hard.
They're hard to find.
We've made some good relationships with farmers that are very much interested in knowing, what their impact and contributions are. And with their partnership, they've let us on their land, and we've had really productive interactions and conversations. And that's important. Our goals in those studies have been talking about nitrogen moving through tile lines is like there's lots of papers on that, right? Like everyone. That's kind of common. We expect that the levels can be high, but we were interested in sort of looking at pesticides and other things that move, and so but we do that. Like we work with. There are plenty of farmers that are really eager to want to better understand, both from an environmental perspective and an economic perspective. I mean, those are their products,
right.
So we think those relationships are really productive, and I've really enjoyed. One particular farmer in Washington County has been great and given us a lot of access, but it's a partnership with lots of dialogue, and but we absolutely need to appreciate that they're conduits that carry stuff, and and given how we've sort of have them all leading into ditches that lead into our streams that build out to our rivers, that ends up being an important part of what the sort of composition of our waterways can look like.
So is the acceleration effect of having things channelized, is that part of why we see higher concentrations of nitrogen? Like if the water was moving slower, again in my fantasy world, if the water was moving slower, if the streams are more travertine, more bendy and stuff, would that nitrogen or nitrate, I don't know if I'm using the right phrase, would it naturally more sink to the bottom and absorb? Or would it not affect it at all?
So I would say that what you really need is you need probably more time for things like even certain forms of pesticides and other things, nitrate being one of them, to interact with sort of the microorganisms and other things that can kind of break things down, right? So we talked about the nitrogen cycle, and that's largely driven by sort of the microbes and the things around us we can't see that sort of chew up carbon, chew up nitrogen, bring them in one form, spit them out in another form. And so, when you get say like a meandering river, you're getting more opportunities for the water to sort of push itself into the land and then get kind of pulled back out.
Right.
And that can be beneficial if it gives it a chance to sort of attenuate through any of those processes. Maybe it gets stuck, maybe it gets biodegraded.
So it's a function of time.
So, yeah, I mean, a lot of it, I mean, generally the thought is you put things back into nature, it's, you know, we've always kind of thought, in fact, they do this in Southern California where I grow up, like they treat wastewater, like we mentioned, like I was mentioning where I got started in my career.
Yeah.
They treat wastewater and they use it for drinking water, but they don't put the treated wastewater right back into the water system. They pump it up into the basin and put it back into the ground because there's this perception that if you put it back into the ground, one, it makes it a little more palatable so people don't think they're actually drinking treated wastewater.
Right.
But there's mineralization, there's natural processes that occur. It imparts taste and odor and other things that we've become accustomed to. And so generally this idea of getting things sort of back into nature or more natural states is, you know, with a hefty grain of salt, it's taken technically like or sort of often viewed to be like a better option. And there's science that you can kind of put behind that, but it's, I don't know, we'd probably be better off if we just didn't have as much of the stuff in the first place that's sort of in the waterways. And so thinking about how we can limit what's moving in the first place so we're not having to hope it gets removed or treated after the fact.
Do you know how many, like you mentioned a program started, I think you said in 2016, where funding was made available for well testing?
Yeah, sure.
Is that right? So do you know what percent of people have tested? Is it, or at least in general, are there still a large number of untested wells in the state of Iowa?
Yeah, so the private wells, Iowa has been pretty progressive in this way, where back in when the Groundwater Protection Act was passed, it included what was called at the time the Grants to Counties program, which would give a certain amount of money every year to each county to do well capping of abandoned wells, rehabilitation of damaged wells, and testing. And the testing started out being focused on nitrate and bacteria.
Oh, okay.
With nitrate and bacteria being two sort of acute human health risks. Like we talked about why nitrate was sort of an acute risk, that if you drink it today, you get sick immediately. Yeah. Bacteria is the same thing, right?
Sure.
Like they'll make you ill.
Right.
That program has been, you know, it's something we should probably boast more about as a state, because a lot of states have struggled to figure out how to monitor and engage private well users because they fall outside the Safe Drinking Water Act. And Iowa was really progressive in kind of at leading the pack and creating that program, and other states have tried to emulate it. They have done really well that as time has evolved and we sort of think about the vulnerabilities of well users, they've done what they can to be more flexible with the use of funds. And so like after flooding, I think they started allowing after flood events, they were allowing some of the money to go towards like shocking of wells to get them disinfected. So that's like where you put chlorine in them to knock them down. But then in 2016, understanding that arsenic was a vulnerability, they added arsenic. And then more recently, they've essentially expanded it to where anything that's regulated could get testing paid for, but you just need to engage Health and Human Services to get sort of a approval to test for something, because they want to make sure you're testing for something that you have to worry about, and it's not like chasing something that's likely not there in your well.
Right.
So it's a really good program. How many people take advantage of it? That's a great question. In fact, once upon a time we looked at this. Some counties are better than others. I mean, this actually starts getting to a question about how well counties have support for things like environmental health specialists, and how many of those specialists they have, because they're often spread apart, not just doing wells, but also septics and maybe restaurant inspections. And so I think generally what we find is like, you know, some counties spend all their money. It won't test every well, but like they will find as many people as they can. Yeah. So
if you are a farmer and you're listening to this and you want to have your well tested and you've never done it before, what is the cost to you?
It depends on what you're testing for, but county public health would be the people to contact, and the nitrate and bacteria tests are pretty reasonable. They're not too expensive, on the tens of dollars scale.
Oh, like under $500?
Oh, yes, definitely. Oh. So, like PFAS, like forever chemicals are expensive, and the tests will run several $100s.
Okay.
But when we talk about things like nitrate, we talk about things like bacteria, those are very standard tests that we're probably talking more on the order of like I should know what the hygienic lab offers, but it's probably like $40 to $50.
Oh wow, okay.
And if you
Okay.
call, and if not that, you can send me angry emails and we'll do it for you for free.
Okay. Or they could just pretend that they had trouble and then contact you
I mean,
and
you
get it
can
for
always
free.
email us. Again, we're a state-funded center, and we are responsive, and we try to work with people, and we'll either connect you with folks that can help
Yeah.
you, or we'll do it ourselves if other folks can't, right?
Okay, this might be one of my last questions because I think we're coming up on an hour. We're 54 minutes. I'm trying to remember how I wanted to frame this question because I don't remember the right words, but it's something like Iowa's one of the few states that hasn't done a survey of its underwater reservoirs or something like that. Does that ring a bell at all? Kind of like there, next to us, there's the Ogallala over in Nebraska, and they've surveyed it. They know how much water is there. Is that a thing here in Iowa, or am I totally messing up something I read from somewhere else?
So I don't know the history there. I do know we have a very active Iowa Geological Survey that's based here at the University of Iowa, led by state geologist Keith Schilling, and he has been very active in trying to find support to do those types of aquifer
That's it.
mapping exercises.
There we go.
And I know
Aquifer
they're
mapping.
doing some,
Okay.
but it takes money, and I think that and so that's always the real challenge with these things is
That's what it was. Is we don't know if we're water mining because we don't know the extent of the specific aquifers,
so
right?
that's it, right? So groundwater that comes with a challenge. It's if you're shallower, it's easier usually to get it recharged through things like rainfall, but
Yeah.
it's more vulnerable to different forms of contaminants that could be land applied and make their way in.
Yeah.
So it's one of these things that if you're deeper, it's harder to recharge, but it's usually less vulnerable from some of those surface
cleaner
risks.
water, but yeah.
So, but you then kind of run into the manganese and the arsenic and the uranium. The deeper you go, you got to kind of deal with the geology.
drinking
And so,
nuclear water.
yeah, and so it's these trade-offs, and I think
Interesting.
but I mean, I think you have to respect those resources. They're finite, especially the ones that are slow to recharge.
Yeah.
And we're growing in certain places of the state, and it's got to be part of the planning. And so I think the Geological Survey doing what they do to sort of advocate for more sort of holistic approaches to understanding what our resources are and what sustainable use patterns look like. And we hear in Johnson County, places like Tiffin and North Liberty have really boomed, and that's great. But I know from my time in California, getting back to these analogies where I was being more like it than I ever thought it would be when I moved here, if you can't develop where you don't have water, and so if we want to keep growing certain communities, you got to make sure you have water that's suitable for use.
Right.
And we juggle water across a lot of different uses, right? I know this has been a bit of a thorny subject in like Northwest Iowa, where there's a lot of animal operations and water use for animal operations. And is that, when things get dry from drought, how do you divvy up the pie when, there's not as much water around as there used to be?
Right. Yeah. I've been wondering where the larger animal, like the CAFOs, are. I haven't seen any yet, but I haven't driven to Northwest Iowa yet.
I mean, yeah.
That's kind of where they generally are, like more of the hog farms and the cattle farms. That's
some of the maps that are out there, like say DNR used to have a map that shows sort of the density of different types of operations in Northwest Iowa.
Yeah.
We've got a good number, I think. Just depends on the size you're looking for.
Yeah. I don't think I'm tackling that topic specifically in the movie. It's just too many things to cover. Okay, you've been interviewed a lot, you said, from a lot of different news sources. This is my last question. We're at 50. I don't have my glasses on. I think that's 56 minutes. Is there a question? This is always my closing question. Out of all the times you've been interviewed, is there ever a question where you're just like, I can't believe they're not asking me this. Why aren't they asking me this? And that you would like to introduce the question or the answer to that?
Well, we never, we didn't really, and this is probably going to take you over an hour. We didn't really talk about sort of the new science of nitrate that has caused folks to really worry about its links to public health beyond the blue baby syndrome.
Oh, I did mean to ask that.
Yeah, there you go. See?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that's where I was at today, is that there's been a lot of more recent science that has looked at things beyond blue baby syndrome as a health consequence of nitrate exposure in drinking water,
Okay.
including some studies done here at the University of Iowa and the prior director of my center that sort of links exposures of nitrate through drinking water to longer term or chronic health impacts like cancer and birth defects at levels that are below that 10 milligram per liter is nitrogen.
Below 10?
Below 10.
That's bad news.
It is bad news. But I mean, just to the timeline on this is, and I try to talk about this timeline more and more, is sort of EPA every 6 years after they amended the Safe Drinking Water Act in 1996, they instituted what's called this 6-year review, where every 6 years they evaluate science, because we talked about how at the time there wasn't a lot of science on other health impacts of nitrate when the standard was set. They look at new science and decide if a standard needs to be revised. And so it was 2010 that they first sort of acknowledged that there was new science on nitrate that could show potential links to cancer, that should show potential links to birth defects, and that a new health assessment was needed that could lead to a revision of the standard, a lowering of the standard. And then what I try to do is walk people through that since 2010, it's not been, that health assessment that they acknowledged needed to be done based off this new science has not been done. So it still hasn't been done to this day in 2025 or 15.
Is it weird that I'm shocked? Like, that seems so surprising. Why haven't they done that assessment? And I don't mean to throw it on you. Like, why didn't you do the assessment, David?
Well, and so the timeline goes is 10 years, so 2010, 6 years passed for the next 6-year review. They hadn't done the assessment, so they kicked it they kicked it down the road a little bit more. 2017, they started the scoping of the document to do the health assessment. But by the time 2017 happened, if you're doing your math with our presidential elections, there's a new administration, and they stopped that assessment, saying it wasn't aligned with agency priorities. Then the Biden administration came in, and they were slow to get it restarted in 2023. Wow. And then now there's been another election. So it's really this unfortunate example of like how environmental policy happens in the U.S. these days, which is we ping pong back and forth depending on presidential administrations. And that's not a very effective way to do environmental policy. And so I often talk about this, that this isn't like a red or blue thing. This is every Iowan should be frustrated that since 2010, EPA has acknowledged that there's the science that probably needs to be considered to weigh for a new standard, and it hasn't happened. And for 15 years, my daughter is 16, my son is 13. That's like their whole lives, basically, that we've acknowledged this and not done it. And it leaves water providers like the Des Moines Water Works in a very weird position, in an uncomfortable position, because people in Iowa are aware of this science, and they're very smart and tuned in. And so there's this questions of, is the water safe enough at 10? Yeah. And, the Waterworks is doing their darndest to treat the water to 10. And I often say that, no one's ever going to treat the water beyond that, just like none of us pay more taxes than we're obligated. Sure. And so this is the situation that we're stuck in Iowa. And so we need to figure out how to break through but it is the problem we're facing. And I think a lot of folks are concerned about that science and what it means for our drinking water.
So what would it take to fund that and to determine that specific link then?
Well, I mean, I think what they would do is that, getting back to those types of health assessments and risk assessments that are done when a standard is set, is they're going to look at the science and they're going to decide. Usually the way this is done is that there's a group at EPA that's a panel of experts in sort of risk assessment and toxicology that weighs the data and says, these are good studies, these are bad studies, do we have enough evidence, what do we make of this, and that's just not happening for whatever reason. Right? And it's kind of unsure what will happen with it going forward, because some of the reorganizations of the EPA and the new administration make it hard to know if there's even the right expertise in place anymore.
I was just thinking, there's the phrase flying blind, but in a way, I'm drinking water blind. Like, I don't really know if maybe 5 years from now, let's say they got all the funding they needed, that they could determine in 5 years, like, should have been 8. Yeah. Should have been 8 parts per million.
So that's definitely a concern, and I've said similar things, like in 20 years, if we figure out that it is, like, nitrate in drinking water is linked to cancer risk, like, we're going to feel pretty foolish that we didn't act sooner. There's been some studies that have sort of tried to put numbers on what nitrate attributable cancer in drinking water would look like, and it's It's the same. It's like I said with smoking, right? Not everybody who smokes gets cancer.
Sure.
It just increased risk. So it's just another potential risk factor, right?
Right.
And it's probably not enough based on sort of the excess cases we have here compared to national averages to sort of explain Iowa's cancer challenges.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that it may not be contributing, right? And so it's this.
Without those dollars for the research and the resources, it's a hard question.
And I don't
to
even
nail
know
down.
so much it's the dollars. It's just like the willpower.
Yeah.
I mean, your guess is as good as mine. Why it hasn't been done, but
Yeah.
I mean, I tend to suspect that I don't know that we'll ever see a nitrate standard get lowered simply because it costs a lot to remove it, and there's a lot of communities that are struggling with it. And to lower to something like 8, like you said, or 5,
Yeah.
would put a lot of water providers and communities in a really tough spot because they'd all have to get
Oh,
new
because
treatment.
then they would.
Yeah, and so whenever a new standard is set, the way we do it now since those
all the
96
infrastructure has
amendments,
to change.
well, the infrastructure would have to change, but before they even decide, before they get to that point, they effectively do like a cost-benefit analysis to determine, like, will a new standard lead to sufficient health improvements that outweigh all the costs it's going to take for every small community, not just in Iowa, but
It's
say
sort of
in
like
the center.
return on investment versus cancer rates.
It is, I mean,
in a
people may
sense.
not like it, but this is how policy gets done, right?
Yeah.
It's the only federal statute for the environment that is entirely based on health is the Clean Air Act. Everything else takes into consideration usually things like economics and technology.
Wow.
And if there are limits in economics and technology, then you don't set as stringent a standard because it would cost too much or it may not be practically feasible. So we make these trade-offs, and so in talking about water quality in Iowa, unfortunately, we have to have these types of discussions on trade-offs. And all I encourage places like the Waterworks or other water providers to do is to at least like talk to their consumers, explain that like we could treat the water more, but you're going to see your bill go up, or we're going to have to do X, Y, and Z thing, and just know that we're going to pass that on to you, and we're going to run into the challenges of affordability and everything else with people that now have higher water bills to pay.
It's an interesting idea, though.
I mean, that's just what needs to happen.
I mean, could a municipality decide on their own, we want to upgrade our infrastructure because the people in our community want it down to 6 parts per million?
They could.
Just preventatively, and we've agreed that we're going to buy the equipment and we're just going to assess an extra fee on their water bill. So they could actually do that, couldn't they?
There's no reason they couldn't, other than it would
Be
cost a lot of money. And I mean, the only thing that I would say in caution of that is that, you know, it's a distribution of people and their ability to pay for water.
Yeah.
And so as long as that's done in a way that's responsible for folks that don't have the resources, as long as there's affordability and assistance and all those things that need to be taken into account, so that you just don't end up with a larger segment of your consumer area that's on shut-off notice because they can't pay their bill, that's not the solution, right?
So technologically speaking, I don't know if I pronounced that right, we do have the ability to reduce it below 10.
Correct.
It would just be a matter of the funds, making sure everyone's able to afford it,
You'd have to buy. So the Waterworks would need to expand its treatment capacity and run it more often. And those two things together, not just the cost of the equipment, the cost of the electricity, and the waste disposal and the people, it's not trivial. But I think that we're at a point now where it you know, enough people in Iowa know about these issues and this uncertainty. Yeah. And we saw that coming to a head this summer, where people didn't even want to drink the water that was below 10. Something's going to have to give here, and I think it has to start with at least like open dialogue about, look, this is what it would take, and here's we're doing the best we can, and you know, if the EPA, I mean, and at the same time, we just got to figure out what the EPA will do in time, right?
I think the key takeaway that we just ended with, which I think is a great place to end, and I thank you for all your time you spent, is I'm ending the interview with just there's just so much uncertainty, and then we could be individually empowered to do things to remove the uncertainty, which is the parts per million in the drinking water, because obviously the issue of what to do about fertilizer application rates, feels way out of our control. But it is interesting that the technology exists. I thought it would be like wildly sort of impossible to get it below 10. So that's interesting. That's to me, that's sort of ending the interview on a hopeful note.
Well, it's people that are listening have their homework to do, right? Sort of, or at least the scenarios to contemplate. Like, right now we're at a point where something has to be done. and there's no, I doubt it, there's no easy paths. So we just have to figure out what people want to do and are willing to do.
Yeah, and then realistically, what is the path of least resistance to having safer drinking water? So that's interesting. Okay, well, thank you so much.
You're welcome,
David. I really appreciate your time and all your knowledge. And
no worries.
Thanks
Thanks
for this interview.
I should thank you. I mean, you want to talk to me, and when people stop wanting to talk to me, then I know I might have a problem.
Okay.